The words were meant to be a killing blow, delivered with the cold precision of a duelist's blade. No one else would have married you. And for a moment, they did their work. Dinah Farrow felt the world narrow to the polished floorboards of the assembly hall, the ring of shocked faces, and the Duke's unreadable gray eyes. He had said it quietly, for her ears alone, a final, brutal severance after the public humiliation. She had been dismissed, disgraced, and now, personally destroyed. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. With a spine straighter than anyone in that room had a right to expect, she turned and walked away from Gregory, the Duke of Kestrel Chase, leaving him standing alone in the circle of silence her departure had created. Her home, if one could call it that, was the cramped house of her aunt, Mrs. Honora Jardine, a place where Dinah was less a niece and more an unpaid, invisible cog in a machine of genteel poverty. For 10 years, since her parents' deaths had left her penniless and dependent, she had been the house's silent engine. It was Dinah who mended the thinning linen, who watered down the soup to make it last another day, who turned her cousin Felicity's gowns so they might pass for new. It was Dinah whose mind for numbers kept the creditors from the door, her careful ledgers tracking every halfpenny earned from her aunt's meager investments, and her own secret work doing accounts for local tradesmen. Her payment was a roof over her head and a constant dripping reminder of her plainness, her poverty, her utter lack of prospects. "Do try to be less present, Dinah," her aunt would say, waving a dismissive hand. "Men are not drawn to competence in a woman. It is unsettling." Felicity, her cousin, was the family's designated beauty, a girl of soft curls and softer mind, whose only duty was to look lovely and secure a profitable marriage. Dinah's duty was to make that possible. She was the backdrop, the scaffolding upon which Felicity's future was being built. She endured it all with a quiet, unbreachable composure. Her emotions were a private country, its borders heavily guarded. She found her solace in order, in the clean lines of a balanced account book, the satisfying logic of a well-mended seam, the quiet rustle of a turned page. Her world was small and meticulously maintained, a fortress against the slights and sorrows of her daily life. Then the Duke had come to Marley. He was a figure of legend in the county, a man made of grief and granite. After his young wife's death 5 years prior, Gregory had sealed himself away in his great estate, Kestrel Chase. The house, once a beacon of society, had fallen silent. The gardens grew wild, the windows stayed dark. He emerged only for the most necessary business, his face a cold mask, his words clipped and rare. He needed, it was said, an archivist. His late father's library and estate papers were in a state of legendary chaos, and the Duke, for reasons no one could fathom, had decided they must be put in order. He came to the coaching inn in Marley to conduct his interviews, a place of public business where Dinah was delivering a finished ledger to the innkeeper. She was not there to see the Duke. She was there to earn the few shillings that bought their meat for the week. While waiting to be paid, she noticed one of the heavy oak tables in the common room had a dreadful wobble. 2 aspiring archivists, young men of good family and flustered manners, were trying to write their letters of application upon it, their inkwells sloshing precariously. Without a word, Dinah knelt, her plain gray skirts pooling on the dusty floor. She ran a practiced hand along the uneven legs, located the problem, and retrieved a thin wedge of wood from the kindling box by the hearth. A few deft movements, a quiet scrape, and the table stood firm. She rose, dusted her hands, and thought no more of it. But the Duke, sitting unnoticed in a shadowed corner, had seen. He had watched the entire small drama. He had seen the fumbling pretension of the applicants and the quiet, unhesitating competence of the woman in gray. He saw a problem identified and solved, without fuss or need for applause. When the innkeeper finally gestured Dinah forward, the Duke rose from his chair. He was taller than she had imagined, and his presence seemed to consume the very air in the room. He ignored the innkeeper, his gaze fixed solely on her. "You," he said. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. "You fixed the table." It was not a question. Dinah inclined her head. "It was unsteady, Your Grace." The others simply complained about it. He looked from her to the two young men, who were now staring, mouths agape. They described the problem at length. You corrected it. He took a step closer. For the first time, she saw the profound exhaustion etched around his eyes. This was not just a cold man. This was a man hollowed out by sorrow. "I require someone to correct a great many problems at Kestrel Chase," he said, his voice dropping even lower. "The work is organizational. It requires precision, logic, and a tolerance for dust and disarray. It pays £20 a month." £20. It was a fortune. It was more than she earned in a year. It was freedom. It was an escape. Her aunt would be furious. Then her aunt would be greedy. Mrs. Jardine would see the money, not the impropriety of her niece working, unchaperoned, in the house of a reclusive duke. "I am interested, Your Grace," Dinah said, her voice perfectly level, betraying none of the frantic hope that had just exploded in her chest. The Duke gave a single, sharp nod. "Be at the gates of Kestrel Chase on Monday morning. A contract will be waiting." He turned and walked out of the inn, leaving behind a stunned silence and the faint, clean scent of winter air. Dinah Farrow stood perfectly still, the innkeeper's few coins suddenly feeling weightless in her hand. For the first time in a decade, a door had opened, and she intended to walk through it. The week leading up to her departure was a masterclass in her aunt's particular brand of emotional warfare. Mrs. Honora Jardine oscillated wildly between outrage at the scandal and avarice for the salary. "A single woman in that house with that man," she would declare to Felicity over their meager tea. "The county will talk. Our reputation will be in tatters." An hour later, she would be calculating. £20 is a significant sum, Dinah. Of course, your room and board here must be accounted for, and there are expenses associated with Felicity's upcoming season. I believe £15 should cover your debt to this family each month. You may keep £5 for your personal needs." Dinah simply agreed. Arguing was a waste of energy, and she needed to conserve all of hers for the task ahead. £5 a month, entirely her own, was still more than she had ever possessed. It felt like a dragon's hoard. Felicity, for her part, was merely bewildered. "But Kestrel Chase is so gloomy, Dinah, and the Duke is terrifying. Why would you want to go there?" "It is a position of employment, Felicity," Dinah answered, carefully folding her one good dress into a small traveling case. "It is what I do." On Monday morning, she walked the 2 miles to the estate, refusing her aunt's grudging offer of a hired cart. The walk settled her mind. The gates of Kestrel Chase were wrought iron and formidable, green with moss and neglect. As she approached, they swung inward, opened by a groundsman whose face was as weathered as the ancient oaks lining the drive. The house appeared at the end of the long, winding path, a great stone edifice that seemed to have grown from the earth itself. It was beautiful, but profoundly sad, its many windows like vacant eyes staring out over a landscape that had forgotten how to bloom. She was met at the door not by the Duke, but by a housekeeper who looked as sturdy and unyielding as the house itself. She was a woman of about 50, with iron-gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her features into a permanent state of disapproval. "Miss Farrow," she said, her voice crisp. "I am Mrs. Ingram. His Grace is in the library. He does not wish to be disturbed. He has left instructions for you." Dinah followed her through a cavernous hall, where dust motes danced in the thin shafts of light from a high, grimed window. The air was cold and still, smelling of damp stone and forgotten things. Furniture stood shrouded in white cloths, like ghosts in a silent ballroom. Mrs. Ingram led her to a small, plain room on the ground floor. It held a narrow bed, a washstand, a simple wardrobe, and a small desk. "This will be your room," the housekeeper stated. "Your meals will be brought here. You are not to take them in the kitchens or the dining hall. You are to have access to the library, the study, and the records room. No other part of the house is your concern. Your work is to be done between 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening. His Grace values his privacy above all else. You will endeavor not to cross his path." The rules were clear. She was not a guest. She was not even a governess. She was a functionary, a ghost meant to haunt only the most neglected corridors of the house. "I understand," Dinah said. "Thank you, Mrs. Ingram." The housekeeper's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were surprised by the lack of argument or complaint. "The library is this way." The library was breathtaking. It was a 2-story chamber lined from floor to ceiling with books, tens of thousands of them. But it was chaos. Books were piled on every surface, spilling from shelves, stacked in precarious towers on the floor. Account ledgers were mixed with poetry. Estate maps were curled up next to philosophical treatises. In the center of the room was a massive desk, and behind it, a man's silhouette against the tall, arched window. The Duke. He did not turn as they entered. "Mrs. Ingram, leave us." The housekeeper departed, closing the heavy oak doors with a soft click. For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint scratching of the Duke's pen. Dinah waited. She did not speak, did not cough, did not shuffle her feet. She simply stood, a still point in the vast, disordered room. Finally, he spoke, his voice quiet, devoid of warmth. "The task is simple. I want it all catalogued. Every book, every document. The estate papers are to be separated, sorted by year, and cross-referenced. A complete inventory. Is that clear?" "Perfectly clear, Your Grace." He still had not looked at her. He gestured with his pen toward a stack of ledgers on the corner of his desk. "Those are from the past 10 years. My former steward was lax. Begin there. Find out where the money has gone." He finally turned his head, and his gray eyes met hers. They were like chips of ice. "I hired you because you appear to be a person who solves problems, not one who creates them. Do not give me cause to regret that decision." He turned back to his work, a clear dismissal. Dinah looked at the mountains of paper and leather, the dust of years, the suffocating silence of the room. It was a Herculean task. Another woman might have been intimidated, overwhelmed. Dinah felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Here was a problem she could understand. Here was a chaos she could conquer. It had rules. It had logic. It was, in its own way, a sanctuary. She walked to a clear space on a long library table, picked up the top ledger from the pile he had indicated, and opened it. The first entry was dated 5 years ago, the month his wife had died. The handwriting was a careless scrawl, and already, on the very first page, she saw an entry that made no sense. A payment of £50 to a supplier in a town that did not exist. She had found her beginning. The days at Kestrel Chase fell into a quiet, monastic rhythm. Dinah would rise with the dawn, take the simple breakfast tray left outside her door, and be in the library as the first light slanted through the tall, dirty windows. She worked through the day, fueled by a lunch tray as silent and anonymous as the first, and did not stop until the light failed. She spoke to no one but Mrs. Ingram, and then only in the briefest of exchanges. She did not see the Duke at all. He remained a ghost in his own house, taking his meals in his private wing, his presence felt only in the perfect stillness he left in his wake. Dinah did not mind the solitude. It was a relief. Here there were no passive-aggressive sighs from her aunt, no vapid chatter from Felicity. There was only the work. And the work was fascinating. The former steward, a Mr. Carmichael, had not been lax. He had been a thief. It was all there, hidden in plain sight within the sloppy columns and vague entries. Payments for phantom repairs, wages for non-existent staff, purchases of livestock that never arrived. It was a slow, methodical bleed, 1,000 small cuts draining the life from the estate. Dinah worked with meticulous care, cross-referencing the ledgers with the few receipts and household books she could find. She started a new ledger, a shadow account, where she documented every discrepancy, every theft, every lie. It was a testament in black and white, a story of betrayal written in numbers. After 2 weeks, her section of the library began to change. The chaotic piles of ledgers were gone, replaced by neat, ordered stacks, each tied with twine and labeled in her clear, precise hand. She had cleaned the windows on her side of the room, and now the afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the rich wood of the shelves she had polished. One afternoon, Mrs. Ingram entered the library carrying not a tray, but a single cup of tea on a saucer. It was a fragrant, steaming Earl Grey, a luxury Dinah had not tasted in years. The housekeeper set it on the table beside her. "You'll work yourself into the grave," Mrs. Ingram said, her voice holding its usual gruffness, but lacking its earlier chill. "Thank you," Dinah said, genuinely surprised. "His Grace, he has noticed the change in here," the housekeeper admitted, almost reluctantly. "He commented on the light." It was the first indication that the Duke was aware of her as anything more than a machine for sorting paper. That evening, as she was packing up her work, he appeared. He entered the library so silently, she didn't sense him until he was standing a few feet from her table. "Report," he said, without preamble. For a moment she was startled, but her composure returned instantly. She did not launch into a long explanation. She simply turned her shadow ledger toward him and opened it to the first page. "The discrepancies begin here, Your Grace, the day after the Duchess's funeral." She pointed to the entry for the phantom supplier. This continues for 5 years. I estimate the total amount stolen to be in excess of £7,000. He stared at the page, his face impassive, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. £7,000 was a staggering sum. He looked from the ledger to her face, his gaze sharp and assessing. Who is the supplier? A company called Northern Imports. I can find no record of its existence. However, she continued, turning a page, the payments were all co-signed by a local gentleman, a Mr. Titus Beaumont. The Duke's expression did not change, but his eyes grew colder, harder. Beaumont, he repeated, the name a flat, dead sound in the quiet room. He has been trying to purchase the North Pasture from me for years. He claimed my father gave him his word on it. Dinah nodded. The deed for the North Pasture is one of the documents I have yet to locate, Your Grace. It seems to be missing from the records room. He was silent for a long time, studying her face, the neat stacks of paper, the clean windows. Continue your work, he said finally. Find the deed. As you turned to leave, he paused. Mrs. Ingram informs me you have been taking your meals in your room. That is no longer necessary. You will dine with me. It was not an invitation. It was a command. And it was, in its own way, more shocking than the discovery of the theft. The master of the silent house had decided he no longer wished to be alone. Their first dinner was an exercise in strained silence. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table that could have seated 30, the cavernous room lit by a single candelabra. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence began to change. It became less of an absence and more of a shared space. He would ask her direct, practical questions about the estate, about the tenants, about the yields from the home farm. She would answer with facts and figures, her memory flawless. He listened, truly listened, in a way no one ever had before. He began to see the keen, logical mind behind her quiet exterior. She, in turn, began to see flashes of the man beneath the grief. One evening, she mentioned the walled garden she had glimpsed from the library window. It was a ruin, choked with weeds and thorns. The Duchess designed it, he said, his voice tight. It was the first time he had mentioned his wife. It was a rose garden. The next Sunday, her day of rest, Dinah put on her sturdiest shoes and a pair of old work gloves she found in a potting shed. She went into the walled garden and began to work. She started in one small corner, pulling up the choking weeds, cutting back the dead wood from a single resilient climbing rose that still clung to the stone wall. It was hard, thankless labor. Her hands grew scratched and sore, but as she cleared the earth, she felt as though she were clearing something inside herself as well. She was not just restoring a garden. She was tending to a place of beauty that had been abandoned to sorrow. She was letting in the light. She did not know that the Duke watched her from his study window for hours, a silent, motionless figure. He watched her patient, determined work, the gentle way she handled the surviving rosebush. He saw not a servant, but a woman bringing life back to a place that had been dead for 5 long years. It was not pity he felt. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. The fragile peace of Kestrel Chase was not destined to last. As spring began to breathe life back into the dormant countryside, the world beyond the estate's gates began to take notice of the changes within. Lights were seen in the windows at night. Smoke curled from more than one chimney, and, most scandalous of all, the reclusive Duke was seen walking the grounds with the plain, penniless niece of Mrs. Honora Jardine. The rumors began in Marley, fanned into flame by two particularly malicious sources, Titus Beaumont and Mrs. Jardine herself. Beaumont, feeling his influence and income stream threatened by the new order at the estate, saw Dinah as a dangerous obstacle. He began to paint her as a conniving opportunist, a woman of low morals who had somehow bewitched the grieving Duke. "She has him wrapped around her little finger," he would say with a knowing smile in the taproom of the local inn. "A man in his state is vulnerable to such creatures." Mrs. Jardine, consumed by a venomous jealousy she mistook for moral outrage, eagerly corroborated the narrative. To her circle of gossiping neighbors, she portrayed herself as a worried, helpless guardian. "I warned her," she would sigh, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. "I told her such a position was improper, but she is a headstrong girl, always has been. One can only pray she does not bring utter ruin upon our family name." The whispers grew into a chorus of disapproval. Dinah felt the shift when she went into Marley for supplies. Shopkeepers who had once been civil were now curt. Women who had known her for years turned their backs as she passed in the street. They saw a usurper, an adventuress. They did not see the woman who spent her days wrestling with a decade of fraudulent accounts and her Sundays coaxing a dead garden back to life. Dinah bore the snubs with her customary fortitude, but they were like small, sharp stones inside her shoe, a constant, irritating reminder of her precarious position. The Duke, insulated by his rank and his long-standing disregard for public opinion, seemed oblivious. Their dinners became the anchor of her day. He started asking her opinion on matters beyond the ledgers. "The tenant on the West Farm reports his roof is failing. What do you recommend?" he asked one evening. "Replacing the thatch is a temporary measure, Your Grace," she replied without hesitation. "The main timbers are rotting. It would be more economical in the long run to replace the entire roof with slate. I have calculated the cost. It could be covered by recovering just 2 of Mr. Carmichael's fraudulent payments." He nodded, accepting her logic as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He had come to rely on her mind, on the clarity and honesty of her assessments. A tentative, unspoken partnership was forming between them, forged in the quiet library and over the long dining table. Titus Beaumont, however, was not a man to be trifled with. When his polite inquiries about purchasing the north pasture were met with a cold, unequivocal refusal from the Duke, he escalated his attack from slander to sabotage. The crisis came to a head at the annual May Assembly, the most important social event of the Marley calendar. The Duke, to the astonishment of the entire county, announced his intention to attend, and he insisted that Dinah accompany him. It was a statement, a challenge. She knew it would be an ordeal. She had only her one good dress, a simple gray silk she had remade twice. But when she came down the grand staircase of Kestrel Chase, the Duke was waiting at the bottom. He was dressed in immaculate evening attire, and for the first time, she saw him not as a grieving recluse, but as the powerful, handsome man he was. He held a small velvet box in his hand. He opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a single, perfect white rose, fashioned from mother-of-pearl and fastened to a silver pin. "From the garden," he said, his voice low. "The first one to bloom." It was the climber she had saved. Her throat tightened. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever been given. She allowed him to fasten it to her dress, his fingers brushing her shoulder, a brief, startling touch that sent a shiver through her. But the warmth of the moment vanished the instant they stepped into the assembly hall. A wave of silence and hostile stares washed over them. Titus Beaumont was holding court in the center of the room, a smug, confident smile on his face. He waited until the Duke was occupied with a local magistrate. Then he made his move. He approached Dinah, his expression a mask of false concern. "Miss Farrow," he said, his voice loud enough for all those nearby to hear. "A word, if I may. A matter of some urgency regarding Kestrel Chase." He led her to the side of the room, near a group of the county's most influential gossips, including Lady Octavia Severin, a formidable dowager whose sharp tongue and sharper mind were legendary. "I have been made aware," Beaumont began, his voice ringing with theatrical gravity, "of a most serious crime. The deed to the North Pasture, a document of immense value, has gone missing from the Duke's library. And I have it on good authority," he paused, letting the silence hang, "that you were the one who took it." A collective gasp went through the onlookers. Dinah's blood ran cold. "That is a lie," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "Oh, is it?" Beaumont's smile was predatory. He produced a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "Then perhaps you can explain this. A letter, in your own hand, to a solicitor in London, discussing the sale of that very deed." He unfolded it. It was her handwriting, or a masterful forgery of it. The room began to swim. She felt hundreds of eyes on her, judging, condemning. She looked for the Duke, but he was across the room, his back to her, still trapped in conversation. She was alone. The Duke turned at the sudden, absolute hush that had fallen over the assembly. He saw the circle of people, their faces a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. He saw Titus Beaumont, holding a piece of paper like a trophy. And in the center of it all, he saw Dinah. Her face was pale, but her head was high. He started toward her, a cold dread coiling in his stomach. Beaumont saw him coming and raised his voice, ensuring the Duke heard every word. "It seems, Your Grace, your trust has been misplaced. Your archivist appears to have been archiving your property directly into her own pockets." He handed the forged letter to the Duke. Gregory took it, his eyes scanning the lines of text. It was a damning fabrication, cleverly constructed, using phrases and details that a thief would know. He looked from the letter to Dinah's face. He was searching for something, a flicker of guilt, a tremor of fear. He saw only a profound, wounded stillness. The entire county was watching, waiting to see how the great, cold Duke of Kestrel Chase would handle this public scandal. Years of ingrained suspicion, of trusting no one after the betrayals that followed his wife's death, rose up in him. His instinct was to shut down, to cauterize the wound, to eliminate the source of the problem. He had built walls around his heart for a reason. This was why. This vulnerability. This was the pain he had sought to avoid. He looked at Dinah, at the pearl rose pinned to her simple dress, a rose from a garden she had brought back to life. And he made a choice. He chose the wall. He turned to her, his face an impenetrable mask of aristocratic disdain. The warmth that had begun to grow between them was gone, replaced by an arctic chill that stunned her more than Beaumont's accusation. "Your employment at Kestrel Chase is terminated, Miss Farrow," he said, his voice clear and carrying in the silent room. "You will vacate the premises by morning." He did not shout. He did not accuse. He simply erased her. And then came the final, quiet cut. The words meant only for her, a twist of the knife before he turned away. "No one else would have married you." He had not meant it as it sounded. It was a mangled, clumsy expression of the thought that her association with him, now tainted by this scandal, had ruined her prospects forever. It was a thought born of his own guilt, but to her, in that moment of supreme humiliation, it sounded like the cruelest, most personal confirmation of her worthlessness. He was telling her that not even he, the man she was beginning to think might see her, truly see her, could ever want her. She did not break. She did not plead. She met his cold gaze for one long, heartbreaking second. Then, with a dignity that shamed every gawking face in the room, she unpinned the pearl rose, placed it carefully on a nearby table, and walked out of the assembly hall. She walked back to Kestrel Chase alone in the dark, the 2 miles feeling like 100. She packed her small case, her hands steady, her movements precise. She took nothing that was not hers, leaving behind the neat stacks of organized papers, the burgeoning shadow ledger, the faint scent of beeswax and lemon oil in the library she had grown to love. She left the ghost of a garden that was just beginning to remember how to live. By the time the sun rose, she was gone, a solitary figure walking back down the long drive, away from the silent, sad house, her future a perfect and terrifying blank. She arrived at her aunt's door like a refugee seeking asylum in a hostile land. Mrs. Jardine opened it, her face a smug mask of pity. "Oh, you poor, foolish girl," she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "I warned you. I told you this would be the end of it. Well, come in. Your old room is just as you left it." Dinah stepped back over the threshold, into the prison she thought she had escaped. The air was thick with the familiar smell of boiled cabbage and disappointment. The house felt smaller, meaner than ever before. She went to her cramped attic room and sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress, her packed case at her feet. For the first time in 10 years, she felt the hot, sharp sting of tears behind her eyes. But she did not let them fall. She would not give them the satisfaction. She had survived before. She would survive now. She did not know that back at Kestrel Chase, a battle was being waged in the soul of a duke. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The moment Dinah walked out of the assembly hall, a profound and terrible clarity descended upon Gregory. He looked at the pearl rose she had left on the table, a small, perfect thing, abandoned. He looked at Titus Beaumont's triumphant smirk and the avid, hungry faces of the crowd. And he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he had made a catastrophic mistake. He had sacrificed the most honest person he had ever met to protect a reputation he didn't even care about. He had reverted to the cold, suspicious man he had been, the man she had begun to heal. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. He left the assembly without another word to anyone, the forged letter clutched in his hand. Back in the library at Kestrel Chase, her library, he now thought of it, a place of order and light she had carved from his chaos, the full weight of his folly crashed down upon him. The room felt empty, hollowed out. Her scent, a faint mix of old paper and soap, lingered in the air, a ghostly accusation. He sat at his desk, the desk she had so often worked near, and spread out the evidence. The forged letter, and beside it, he placed her shadow ledger, which he had retrieved from her work table. For hours, he worked. He was a man who prized logic, and he applied it now with a desperate intensity. He compared the handwriting on the forgery to her clear, consistent script in the ledger. There were minute, crucial differences a casual observer would miss, but he, who had spent weeks studying her work, saw them clearly. The loop of the G, the cross of the T. It was a clever copy, but it was not hers. Then he examined the content. The letter mentioned a specific solicitor in London. On an impulse, he went to his late father's correspondence boxes, which Dinah had sorted but not yet catalogued. He searched for the solicitor's name. He found it. The man had been his father's solicitor, yes, but he had been disbarred for fraud 3 years ago. It was a detail only someone with inside knowledge of his family's past affairs would know, or someone who had been deeply involved with the estate's previous, corrupt steward. The pieces began to fall into place. Beaumont and Carmichael, the theft, the missing deed. This forgery was not a simple act of malice. It was a desperate attempt to silence the person who was on the verge of exposing them completely. He looked at her ledger again, at the meticulous, undeniable proof of their crimes. She had handed him the weapon to destroy them, and he had turned it on her instead. A wave of self-loathing washed over him, so powerful it almost buckled him. He had taken her quiet competence, her unwavering integrity, and thrown it back in her face in the most public and brutal way possible. And his final words, "No one else would have married you." He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, the memory of her face in that moment searing itself into his mind.
He had meant to say her reputation was ruined. He had meant to express his own failure to protect her. But it had come out as the ultimate insult, a confirmation of every slight she had ever endured about her plainness, her poverty. He had confirmed her aunt's narrative, that she was worthless. He paced the library through the long, dark hours of the night, a caged animal of his own making. Grief for his wife had been a clean, sharp pain. This was a ragged, dirty wound, self-inflicted. He knew 2 things with absolute certainty. First, he had to destroy Titus Beaumont. Second, and far more importantly, he had to get Dinah back. Not as an employee, as something more, as the center of his life, the partner he hadn't known he was searching for. Forgiveness might be impossible, but he had to try. He would not beg, he would not offer pretty words. He would offer truth and evidence. He would use the very methods she had taught him. He spent the remainder of the night writing. He wrote a detailed letter to the county magistrate, enclosing pages copied from Dinah's ledger and his findings about the disbarred solicitor. He laid out the case for fraud and conspiracy against Beaumont and Carmichael with cold, irrefutable logic. He dispatched it with his fastest rider before dawn. Then he wrote a letter to Lady Octavia Severin. He did not apologize for his behavior, but he laid out the facts, appealing to the sharp intelligence he knew lay beneath her gossiping exterior. He asked her to suspend her judgment until all the evidence was presented. He knew her opinion held more weight in the county than any other. Finally, he prepared himself for the most difficult task of all. He would go to her. He would not send a note. He would not send a servant. He would go himself and face her, and her harridan of an aunt, and he would make his case. As the first gray light of dawn broke over the estate, Gregory, Duke of Kestrel Chase, was a man transformed. The grief and apathy that had shrouded him for 5 years had been burned away by the fires of shame and a fierce, new-found purpose. He knew what he wanted. He wanted the woman who fixed wobbly tables, who brought light to dark rooms, who saw the truth in a column of numbers, and who had the strength to walk away from a duke with her head held high. He wanted Dinah Farrow. The sun was barely up when the sounds began. A carriage rumbling to a halt on the cobblestones outside Mrs. Jardine's house was a rare event. 2 was an anomaly. 3 was a cataclysm. Dinah was in the small, neglected back garden, pulling weeds with a vengeance, when her cousin Felicity came running out, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement.
"Dinah, you must come! There are carriages! 3 of them!"
Dinah rose slowly, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a play. She followed Felicity to the front parlor, where Mrs. Jardine was peering through the curtains, her face pale. The first carriage was a plain, functional vehicle, and 2 men in official-looking coats were knocking firmly at the door of the house next door, Titus Beaumont's residence. The second carriage was far grander, a deep, lacquered green with a crest on the door, Lady Octavia Severin's crest. And the third was the Duke's. A gleaming black coach, with 2 fine horses stamping impatiently. As they watched, the Duke himself stepped out. He was not dressed for a morning call. He was dressed in the same formal evening attire as the night before, as if he had not slept, as if the night had never ended. There was a knock at their own door. Mrs. Jardine, flustered, gestured for Dinah to answer it, unwilling to face whatever storm was breaking. Dinah opened the door. It was Lady Octavia's footman. "Lady Octavia Severin presents her compliments to Miss Farrow," he intoned, "and requests a private word." Before Dinah could respond, the Duke strode up the path. He did not look at the footman. He looked only at Dinah. His face was stark in the morning light, his eyes holding an intensity that made her breath catch. "Miss Farrow," he said, his voice rough, "I have come to speak with you." From next door, a commotion erupted. The 2 officials were now escorting a sputtering, incredulous Titus Beaumont from his house. He looked wild-eyed and disheveled. "This is an outrage!" he bellowed. "On whose authority?" One of the men held up a paper. "On the authority of the county magistrate, Mr. Beaumont, on evidence provided by His Grace the Duke of Kestrel Chase." Beaumont's eyes found the Duke, his face contorted with rage. "You," he spat. "You will regret this. That woman has poisoned you against me." He was bundled into his carriage, and it rumbled away, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. The street, which had been filling with curious onlookers, was now a theater. At the center of the stage were Dinah and the Duke. Mrs. Jardine, realizing the tide had turned dramatically, rushed to the door. "Your Grace, what a surprise! Do come in. This dreadful business with Mr. Beaumont. We are all so shocked. My poor, maligned niece." The Duke cut her off with a single, cold look. "I will speak with Miss Farrow. Alone." He stepped over the threshold, forcing Mrs. Jardine to retreat into the cramped hallway. His presence filled the small, shabby house, making it seem even more pathetic. Lady Octavia Severin, tired of waiting, descended from her own carriage. She was a vision of silver-haired authority, her cane striking the cobblestones with sharp, decisive taps. She marched up to the door. "Gregory," she said, her voice like cracking ice, "I received your letter. It seems I owe Miss Farrow an apology. We all do." She looked past the Duke to Dinah. "Miss Farrow, when this lumbering fool is finished, you will come and take tea with me. I have a proposition for you. My own companion is retiring, and I find myself in need of a woman with a spine of steel and a mind that works. You, it appears, have both." It was an offer of protection, of employment, of social rehabilitation, all delivered in one brisk, unsentimental package. A lifeline. Mrs. Jardine looked as if she might faint. Her entire world, built on whispers and insinuations, was being dismantled on her doorstep before breakfast. The Duke did not acknowledge Lady Octavia beyond a slight inclination of his head. His focus was entirely on Dinah. "Please," he said, and the word was raw, unfamiliar in his mouth.
May we speak? Dinah looked at the 3 carriages, one for justice, one for sanctuary, one for… what? She looked at her aunt's shocked face and Felicity's bewildered one. The prison walls were crumbling. For the first time, she had choices. She had power. She met the Duke's gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Very well, Your Grace," she said, her voice calm and steady. "We will speak. In the garden." She led him through the house, past the disapproving portraits of her ancestors, and out into the small, unruly patch of earth where she had been seeking solace. She turned to face him, the morning sun at her back, forcing him to look up at her. She would not make this easy for him. He had torn down her world in public. He would have to rebuild it, stone by stone, right here, right now. He stood before her in the messy garden, a place of stubborn, untidy life, and felt the inadequacy of any words he had prepared. The Duke, a man used to commanding, was at a complete loss. She was waiting, her silence a formidable defense. He decided on the only path he knew, the one she had taught him, plain, unvarnished truth. "I was wrong," he began, his voice low and devoid of its usual authority. "What I did at the assembly was inexcusable. I acted out of a cowardice I did not know I possessed. I sacrificed you to protect myself from gossip, and it was the most dishonorable act of my life." He paused, watching her face. It remained a calm, neutral mask. There was no encouragement there. He had to go on. "My final words to you were a monstrosity. There is no excuse for them. I can only explain them. I saw the ruin Beaumont's lie would bring upon your reputation, and I felt responsible. The words were a mangled expression of my own guilt, but that does not change what they were, or the pain they must have caused. For that, I am profoundly sorry." He had never apologized to anyone in his adult life. The words felt foreign, but right. Dinah's expression flickered for the first time. A hint of surprise, perhaps. But she said nothing. He had to give her more than words. He had to give her evidence. "I spent the night reviewing the facts," he continued, his tone becoming more grounded, more like himself. "Your ledger, the forgery, the connection between Beaumont and Carmichael. You were right about all of it. You were on the verge of exposing a conspiracy, and they tried to silence you. I have sent all the proof to the magistrate. Beaumont will face justice. Carmichael will be next." He was offering her vindication, a public clearing of her name. It was a necessary step, but he knew it was not the heart of the matter. The true damage was not public. It was private, between the two of them. "I came here this morning for one reason," he said, taking a half-step closer. "To ask you to return to Kestrel Chase." Her chin lifted slightly. "As your archivist, Your Grace. I believe my employment was terminated." The quiet words held a sharp edge of steel. She was not going to let him forget. "No," he said quickly, "not as my archivist. The position is no longer vacant." He reached into his coat and pulled out the small mother-of-pearl rose. He had retrieved it from the table after she left. He held it out to her on the palm of his hand. "The lady of the house must oversee her own gardens." Dinah stared at the rose, then back at his face. Her heart was beating a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. "I do not understand you," she said, and it was the simple truth. "I am asking you to marry me, Dinah." He said her name for the first time,
and it felt like a key turning in a lock. He took another step, closing the distance between them. "I am not asking because I think you have no other options. As you can see," he gestured vaguely toward the street, where Lady Octavia was now impatiently tapping her cane. "You have excellent options. I am not trying to rescue you. I am asking because, in the space of a few short months, you have become indispensable to me. You have brought order to my house and my life. You see the world with a clarity I have lost. I am a better man when I am in your presence." He looked down at his own hands, then back at her, his gray eyes stripped of all their defenses. "I am not an easy man. I am silent, and I am set in my ways. But I am an honest one. And the honest truth is this: Kestrel Chase is just a cold, empty house without you. I am just a cold, empty man without you." He was not kneeling. He was not offering poetry. He was offering a partnership, stated in the language of fact and evidence. He was offering her the truth, just as she had always offered it to him. Dinah looked at him, truly looked at the man before her. She saw the exhaustion, the sincere regret, the frightening vulnerability in his eyes. He was not a prince from a fairy tale. He was a flawed, grieving man who had made a terrible mistake and was now trying, in his own plain-spoken way, to make it right. He had seen her. He had seen her competence, her intelligence, her integrity. And then he had failed her. But he had come back. He had fought for her. She thought of the life that awaited her with Lady Octavia, respectable, safe, and lonely. Then she thought of Kestrel Chase, of the quiet library, the nascent rose garden, and the silent, difficult man who made her feel more seen than anyone in her entire life. It was a choice, finally. Her choice.
Not a fate she had to endure, but a future she could select.
She reached out and, with steady fingers, took the pearl rose from his palm.
"The roof on the West Farm," she said, her voice soft but clear. "It will need slate, Gregory, not thatch."
A slow, incredulous smile spread across his face, transforming his harsh features into something boyishly hopeful. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. "Slate," he agreed, his voice thick with emotion. "Whatever you say." He took her hand, the one not holding the rose, and raised it to his lips. He did not kiss it. He simply held it to his cheek, a gesture of such profound reverence and relief that it finally broke through the last of her defenses. The tears she had refused to shed last night now welled in her eyes. But these were not tears of pain or humiliation. They were tears of a deep, quiet, and overwhelming joy. 1 year later, the walled garden at Kestrel Chase was a symphony of color and scent. Roses of every shade, crimson, blush, ivory, and gold, climbed the ancient stone walls and filled the air with their perfume. The paths were clear, the beds were neat, and in the center, a small fountain trickled, its music a gentle counterpoint to the buzzing of bees. Dinah, now the Duchess of Kestrel Chase, walked along the path, her hand resting on her husband's arm. The plain gray dress was gone, replaced by a simple but elegant gown of deep blue that matched the cornflowers blooming at her feet. But the greatest change was not in her clothes. It was in her face. The guarded, watchful expression was gone,
replaced by a serene confidence. She was no longer a woman enduring her life. She was a woman inhabiting it. Gregory had changed too. The harsh lines of grief around his eyes had softened. He smiled often, a quiet, private smile, reserved mostly for his wife. He was still a man of few words, but his silences were now comfortable, filled with an unspoken understanding that ran deeper than any conversation. Kestrel Chase itself was transformed. The dust cloths were gone, the windows gleamed, and the house was often filled with light and warmth. It was not a center of lavish society, that was not their way, but it was a place of quiet hospitality, of good stewardship, where tenants were treated fairly and the land was beginning to thrive. Lady Octavia Severin was a frequent visitor, her sharp tongue a welcome tonic. She and Dinah had become firm friends, an alliance of intelligent women that the county had learned not to underestimate. Titus Beaumont was gone, his reputation shattered, and his finances in ruins after the fraud trial. He had sold his property and moved away in disgrace. Mrs. Jardine, stripped of her most potent weapon, Dinah's dependency, had retreated into a state of permanent, aggrieved complaint in Marley. She had received a letter from the Duke's solicitor, informing her that an annuity would be settled on Felicity upon her marriage, provided the girl conducted herself with propriety. It was Dinah's quiet way of ensuring her cousin had a chance at a life not dictated by their mother's bitterness. Felicity had written Dinah a short, stilted letter of congratulations, with a postscript of genuine, if clumsy, apology. Dinah had answered with kindness. The bond was not repaired, but it was no longer broken. As they reached the center of the garden, Gregory stopped and turned to his wife. He touched the small pearl rose she always wore pinned to her dress. "Do you remember what I first said to you?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. She smiled. "You said you fixed the table." "So you did," he said. "You have fixed everything." He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, familiar kiss that spoke of shared mornings and quiet evenings, of partnership and peace. It was not a dramatic storybook romance. It was something quieter, stronger, and more real. It was a love built not on first glances, but on second chances.
It was a love built on the solid foundation of ledgers and logic, of truth-telling and trust. And here, in the heart of the garden she had brought back from the dead, surrounded by the beauty they had cultivated together, Dinah knew she was finally, truly, home. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.